Mr. Bozeman, Mrs. Britt, Mr. Budd, Ms. Cantwell, Mrs. Capito, Mr. Cassidy, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Curtis, Mr. Daines, Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin, Ms. Ernst, Mr. Fetterman, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Gallego, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mr. Haggerty, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hawley, Mr. Heinrich, Mr. Hickenlooper, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mr. Husted, Mrs. Hyde-Smith, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Justice, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kelly, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. Kim, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Langford, Mr. Lee, Mr. Lujan, Ms. Lummis, Mr. Markey, Mr. Marshall, Mr. McConnell, Mr. McCormick, Mr. Merkley, Mrs. Moody, Mr. Moran, Mr. Moreno,
Aye.
Mr. Mullen, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Ossoff, Mr. Padilla, Mr. Paul, Mr. Peters, Mr. Reed, Mr. Ricketts, Mr. Risch, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schiff, Mr. Schmidt. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Scott of Florida. Mr. Scott of South Carolina. Mrs. Shaheen. Mr. Sheehy. Ms. Lotkin. Ms. Smith. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Thune. Mr. Tillis. Mr. Tuberville. Mr. Van Hollen. Mr. Warner. Mr. Warnock. Sir. Ms. Warren. Mr. Welch. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wyden. Mr. Young. Senators voting in the affirmative: Banks, Barrasso, Blackburn, Britt, Budd, Cassidy, Cotton, Ernst, Grassley, Haggerty, Hawley, Hyde-Smith, Kennedy, Moreno, Paul, Schmidt, Scott of Florida, Tillis, and Young. Senators voting in the negative: Duckworth, Durbin, King, Lujan, Murkowski, Murphy, Padilla, Peters, Sanders, Warner, and Welch. Ms. Lotkin. Ms. Lotkin, no. Mr. Sheehy. Mr. Sheehy, aye. Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schatz, no. Mrs. Moody. Mrs. Moody, aye. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Crapo, aye. Mr. Scott. Mr. Scott of South Carolina, aye. Ms. Rosen. Ms. Rosen, no. Mr. Tuberville. Mr. Tuberville, aye. Mr. Husted. Mr. Husted, aye. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson, aye. Mr. Risch. Mr. Risch, aye. Mr. Kelly. Mr. Kelly, no. Mr. Ricketts, Mr. Ricketts, aye. Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blumenthal, no. Mr. Daines, aye. Mr. Justice, aye. Ms. Cantwell, no. Mr. Graham, aye. Ms. Collins, no. Mr. Marshall, aye. Ms. Lummis, aye. Mr. McCormick, aye. Mr. Schumer, no. Mrs. Gillibrand, no. Mr. Sullivan, aye. Mr. McConnell, aye. Mr. Wyden, no. Ms. Alsobrooks, no. Mr. Kramer, aye. Ms. Blunt Rochester, no. Mr. Kim, no. Mr. Merkley, no. Mr. Langford, aye. Mr. Kane, no. Mr. Warnock, no. Ms. Hirono, no. Mr. Booker, no. Mrs. Murray, no. Mr. Heinrich, no. Ms. Cortez Masto, no. Mr. Rounds, aye. Mr. Moran, aye. Mr. Reed, no. Mr. Thune, aye. Mr. Cornyn, aye. Ms. Warren, no. Ms. Hassan, no. Mr. Ossoff, no. Mr. Fetterman, no. Ms. Smith, no. Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Van Hollen, no. Mr. Markey, no. Mr. Coons, no. Ms. Baldwin, no. Mr. Hickenlooper, no. Mrs. Shaheen, no. Mr. Bozeman, aye. Ms. Klobuchar, no. Mr. Hoven, aye. Mr. Schiff, no. Mr. Bennett? Mr. Bennett, no. Mrs. Capito? Mrs. Capito, aye. Mr. Wicker? Mr. Wicker, aye. Mrs. Fisher? Mrs. Fisher, aye. Mr. Cruz? Mr. Cruz, aye. Mr. Mullen? Mr. Mullen, aye. Mr. Lee? Mr. Lee, aye. Mr. Gallego? Mr. Gallego, no. Mr. Curtis, aye. Mr. Whitehouse, no.
The yeas are 51, the nays are 49. The confirmation is confirmed. Under the previous order, the motion to reconsider is considered made and laid upon the table, and the President will be immediately notified of the Senate's actions.
President.
Senator from Illinois.
Mr. President, in about 2 hours, the Senate will vote on whether to confirm Kash Patel to serve as Director of the Federal Bureau of Investigations for the next...
Order.
To serve as Director of the Federal Bureau of Investigations for the next 10 years. 10 years, Mr. President. If Senate Republicans confirm Mr. Patel, I believe they will come to regret this vote, probably sooner rather than later. I, for one, am convinced that Mr. Patel has neither the experience, the judgment, nor the temperament to lead this amazing criminal investigative agency. It appears my Senate Republican colleagues are ignoring the many red flags in Mr. Patel's record, probably because they fear retribution from the President and Mr. Musk. Let me be clear. This is not a partisan issue. During my time in the Senate, I have voted for 4 FBI director nominations before this one. Each one was clearly a Republican, and I voted for them nevertheless. Historically, the Federal Bureau of Investigation has been apolitical. I oppose Mr. Patel because he is dangerously politically extreme. He has repeatedly expressed his intention to use our nation's most important law enforcement agency to retaliate against his political enemies. Even before President Trump took office, Mr. Patel announced that he would force out FBI Director Chris Wray, who he nominated in his first term before firing the former FBI Director Jim Comey. The director is the only political appointment at the FBI. Congress took steps to ensure that this agency remains as apolitical as possible by providing for a single term of 10 years for a director and subjecting the appointment to the advice and consent of the Senate. 50 years ago, we made this reform. We may see it all fall to ashes today. But as we have seen for weeks now, the Trump administration purge of the FBI is a political exercise that is spread to service career officials. There's an association of FBI agents, and the 2 leaders of that association came to see me recently in my office to talk about this situation. Both of them are women. One is serving 17 years in the career job at the FBI, and the other 22. They were quick to add that their fathers had been FBI agents before them. It was clearly in their blood. They came to tell me about the situation at the FBI today because of this transition and because of the prospect of Kash Patel heading their agency. They said morale has never been lower. They've gone through, many of them, gone through many presidential transitions and have never seen anything like this. The declaration that is required now of FBI agents as to whether they were participating in the investigation of the January 6 rioters who assaulted this United States Capitol building. Let's be honest about what's going on here. There's an effort to have Soviet-style historical revision. The Trump administration and the people that they're pushing into leadership have to basically pass a loyalty oath in terms of the outcome of the previous presidential election and what happened on January 6th. They're somehow asked to ignore the obvious that we see on videotape over and over again. The rioters assaulted this Capitol. It was so dangerous that the Vice President of the United States, sitting in your chair, was physically removed by the Secret Service for fear that he was going to be hurt if he stayed in that position. Those of us who are on the floor of the Senate on January 6th were asked to evacuate this chamber as quickly as possible. This was not simply a question of tourists getting out of line. These people who assaulted this U.S. Capitol building were hell-bent on stopping the constitutional process of counting the electoral votes in the 2020 election. And now, FBI and others are being asked to say the opposite, that this wasn't somehow a breach of law, a horrendous, terrible chapter in the history of this country, and that there was danger afoot. Because the president has given a sweeping pardon to the 1,600 who were prosecuted for trespass, seditious conspiracy, the use of firearms in the Capitol, and the like, we are supposed to somehow discount this as a significant moment in American history. It was. And for the FBI agents who participated in the investigation of that day, I say they were doing their job, and they did it well. And now to remove them from the FBI because of that has obviously hurt the morale of the FBI agency and made them stop and wonder what the future holds for them if another president comes in with another political agenda. Will they be the victims again? As we've seen for weeks now, the Trump administration's purge of the FBI is a political exercise that has spread to senior career officials. In the FBI long history, this has never happened before. This purge has dramatically weakened the FBI's ability to combat national security threats and has made America less safe. Senior leaders with collectively hundreds of years of experience have been forced out, creating a leadership vacuum. Thousands of line agents fear losing their jobs simply because they were assigned to work on cases involving the January 6th attack or President Trump. I have heard directly from FBI agents who now fear for their safety and the safety of their families. To understand why, let me tell you about a January 6th rioter named Edward Kelly. Mr. Kelly was convicted of assaulting law enforcement during the attack on the U.S. Capitol. We saw it, didn't we? In terms of videotapes that show our law enforcement agents trying to stand their ground in this Capitol building, being beaten back and assaulted by these mobs. Mr. Kelly was convicted of assaulting law enforcement, and he was given a full and unconditional pardon by Donald Trump. But Mr. Kelly has also been convicted in his home state of Tennessee of conspiracy to murder the FBI agents who investigated his role in the January 6th attack. Understand this. Now he is arguing that President Trump's blanket pardon of Mr. Kelly should cover his attempt to kill FBI agents. When asked about the possible firings of career FBI officials at his confirmation hearing, Mr. Patel, under oath, and I quote, said, "I don't know what's going on right now at the FBI." Mr. President, that's not true. Thanks to multiple brave whistleblowers, we now know that Mr. Patel likely committed perjury in making that statement. Even before being confirmed as an FBI director, Mr. Patel is already directing the ongoing purge of honorable career public servants. Despite his status as a private citizen, he has no right to be part of this awful process. I urge my Republican colleagues, seriously, consider these credible whistleblower allegations before you vote on Mr. Patel's nomination. Mr. Patel's claim about an FBI purge were not his only misleading statements under oath. At his hearing, Mr. Patel implausibly told me he could not recall Stu Peters, a man who's been identified as an anti-Semitic Holocaust denier. What about Stu Peters? Don't know the man. Don't recognize the name. This is simply not true. Considering that Mr. Patel appeared on Mr. Peters' podcast 8 times, Mr. President, 8 times, and he couldn't recall the man's name. And Mr. Peters has since revealed that he and Mr. Patel directly communicate via their personal cell phones, quote, constantly. Constantly was the word he used. As far as Patel was concerned, under oath, never heard of the man. Why in the world would he do that? Why would Mr. Patel admit the obvious? 8 podcasts and constant communication with this man? And an even larger question, what is he doing as a man who wants to direct the FBI in concert with anti-Semitic Holocaust denier Stu Peters? What is going on here? Is he showing good judgment? Is this the kind of person you want to put in charge of 38,000 criminal investigators? Mr. Patel also claimed, quote, he didn't have anything to do with the recording of the so-called January 6th prison choir, which included at least 6 rioters who violently assaulted police officers. Mr. Patel thinks there's something interesting, maybe even amusing, about the fact that he created a choir of these individuals who had been prosecuted for what they did on January 6. Here's what Mr. Patel said to Steve Bannon after he denied knowing anything about this recording before the Judiciary Committee recently. He said to Steve Bannon, quote, "We got this idea to record the January 6 prisoners who recite the national anthem every night from the DC prison. Then we took that to the studio, so we mastered and digitized that." So on Steve Bannon's show, he is the mastermind behind this recording of these prisoners saying something about the national anthem every night. That particular tape that he created of the January 6 choir was taken to Trump rallies too.